Hi class, this is Professor Cook. This week we're going to be looking at Chapter 5, which is Groups, Networks, and Organizations. So from the title slide here, you can kind of see that we're going back to some foundational concepts in sociology. And we're looking at that. If you remember way back to week 1 or 2, we talked about micro and macro levels of analysis in sociology. The most micro level that we would really look at would be the individual, and then moving up from there to the most macro level, which would be comparing societies. So, groups, networks, organizations, and social institutions exist in that range between micro and macro levels of analysis. Okay, so we're going to kind of start with the macro level a little bit, the more macro level, and looking at social institutions. And this is really timely, and I'm probably going to put together a more specific little video lecture for you about how these concepts help us understand the response we're seeing right now to the coronavirus pandemic. Okay, but backing up, there are 5 major social institutions worldwide that we see pretty universally in one form or another in societies. These are the family, the economy, politics or government, education, and religion. Family, economy, politics, education, and religion. Of course, those can take different forms in different societies. How we understand religion or the educational system is different than people would have understood it many years ago or in other parts of the world. Other really important institutions right now to think about are healthcare, law, the legal system, and the military. So, what is a social institution? It's essentially just a way to meet the needs of society that also meets the needs of individuals. Okay, we could talk about how institutions are or are not succeeding at this. That's a slightly different topic. Right now, we're just thinking about the concept in general, okay, of what these would be. By the way, as you'll see in Soc 101, we talk about social institutions generally, and then in Soc 102, we go into each of these institutions in more depth. So the second half of your book, if you're interested, looks at these particular institutions. And also, if you are taking 102, hold on to your book because we use the same one. Okay, so if we were in class, I would walk you through this introduction activity. One way to think about institutions is as sort of government level or large scale social networks or organizations. So if I say the educational system in the United States, you have a sense of what I mean by that. But we can also think of them, as I kind of said on the last slide, as ways of getting things done, ways of meeting needs for society, institutionalized official ways of meeting needs. So I like this quote from my colleague Lisa Wade: persistent patterns of social interaction aimed at meeting the needs of a society that can't easily be met by individuals alone. That is how Dr. Wade adds to the definition of social institutions. Okay, so if you think about right now the healthcare system, we can't all meet our own needs in that respect because we have that division of labor, right, from Durkheim, where we don't any single one of us doesn't have all the knowledge we need to meet an entire country's, let alone probably our own basic healthcare needs. One other way we talk about this that's kind of fun is to consider naming conventions as a social institution. So if you think about your name, your first name, your last name, what does your name mean? Who named you? And that is going to be different in different times and places. But what's interesting about this, if you look in the notes of this slide, you can see some links to name patterns in the United States over the last 100 years or so. And essentially, what they're arguing is that we are seeing more loosening of gender roles because men and boys and girls in the United States are being named in more unique ways. And what the conclusion is there by, I think it's Tristan Bridges who put that together, is that basically because we're seeing more uniqueness among boys' names, catching up to uniqueness among girls' names, that's undermining traditional familial expectations of the name, like if you were named for your father and your father's father, etc. And just to talk about my name, I can tell you that Cook is my married name, and it means person who cooks food. Ironically, I do little of that. I do more, maybe my last name, if it's what I do, should be Professor, right? Or if it's related to my food relationship, it should probably be Tanya, who orders Chipotle all the time. But my first name, Tanya, comes from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Eve, the spring queen Titania, queen of the fairies, which I think that's pretty cool. I like that. I like being a queen. My maiden name before I got married was German, and it was Leiser. And Leiser means from the swamp. So if you put together my first name and my last name, my maiden name, it means Queen of the Fairies from the Swamp. So that's kind of fun. All right, moving on. I want to go kind of back down a level or two on the macro-micro analysis level scale and look at social groups, okay, and how they affect our identity and our interactions. Right now, I think we're all feeling a lot of isolation, and a lot of our relationships with our groups are being changed through this shelter at home situation, okay? But all a social group is all it is two or more people who interact with one another and share a common identity. So they're the building blocks for most of our interactions. Georg Simmel, who you're going to read about, it looks like Simmel, but it's Simmel because it's German. Simmel's insights about this, they're going to go in your book, and I want you to look at this in your book, into dyads, triads, and different Latin names, but you could summarize his insights in the following ways. The size of any group affects how the members in that group behave. So as you could imagine, a smaller group is probably going to have more intimate relationships with one another. You're going to know each other better. So think about how well you know the people you live with, which may be your family members or friends, versus people in your class at CCA, right? That's a larger group. You don't know likely everything about those individuals the way you do people in your family. Okay, so one insight is the larger the group, that it's going to affect how people behave. The size of the group affects how people behave. Larger groups are more stable, but less intimate. What this means is the larger the group, the more that group can persist as a group if one person leaves. Versus if you think about a dyad or even a triad, it's difficult for a family of two people to continue to exist if one person leaves that group. Okay? So that's basic insights on size of group and how that affects relations. This distinction I'm going to share with you next and explain a little bit comes from our old friend Charles Horton Cooley with the Looking Glass Self. And he described groups in a more qualitative way than Simmel's number-based explanation for group size, persistence, and intimacy. All right. So for Cooley, a primary group is a small group of people for an individual that has more personal relationships and interacts face to face, usually over an extended period of time. So for most of us, this is going to be our family or our close friends. So our primary group is the group that we are likely stuck at home with right now, or who we're missing a lot if we're not physically residing with that group. These people in our primary group, we expect this relationship to last a long time. There's not a time limit on our intention to be a part of that primary group. And we are valued in that group just because of who we are, not because of a role we play. Okay, I'm going to move on, and I think this will make more sense in a minute. Secondary groups, on the other hand, are larger, more formal, and less private or intimate groups, where members of these groups are trying to accomplish some kind of goal. So usually we're collecting in secondary groups to accomplish a goal or activity. So our Soc 101 class this semester is a secondary group. We are all parts of that, but we're not necessarily going to continue to do assignments and have video chats and video lectures next semester together unless we all take the same class again. Some of you may form friends or important relationships through meeting people in classes, but then that person would sort of transition to being in your primary group from a secondary group, if that makes sense. But generally, a secondary group is time limited, goal oriented, and does not persist as long as a primary group. So I like this table from a previous textbook that compares and contrasts the basic characteristics of primary and secondary group. The main things to understand here are that a primary group is usually something that you'll have one of throughout your life, and a secondary group, you'll be a part of many secondary groups. Also, take a look at that, the part here about the person being valued for their own sake in a group versus it being goal-oriented. Okay, so here's a contrast for you. I have a 16-year-old daughter, as I've mentioned. I cannot just go find any 16-year-old girl and substitute her for my child in the primary group. That would be illegal, weird, and really, really upsetting, okay? So no one person can stand in, if you will, for another person or be substituted in a primary group. In a secondary group, however, we can have a different person play that role. So I know that I'm really special as a teacher, hopefully, and have unique traits, but you could take this class with another professor and learn just as much and probably not have as much fun and read as many comic books and hear as many bad jokes, but you would still get that information. So that means that's that difference there between being valued for the person's personality versus for the role that they fulfill. All right, so here's a little mini quiz you can do to kind of test your knowledge on whether this is a primary or secondary group. The answers for this are in the notes section of the slide, so you can check that out. Okay, I want to just cover a couple of more concepts on groups, and then we'll save the rest for next time. All right, so you've got your Mean Girls picture here. I like the movie Mean Girls because for me it really illustrates a lot of concepts in this chapter. And one of the most important concepts you can really pick up on in this film is the construction and the boundary construction and maintenance of in-groups and out-groups. Okay, and we don't, here as sociologists, we're not talking necessarily about the popular kids versus the nerds. We're talking about what do those constructions of those groups mean and how our boundaries shifted around individuals. So if you are a part of an in-group, you think of each other as a group. You share a sense of identity. You think of yourself as different from people outside of that group. So to some extent, families can be in groups, right? In my family, we define ourselves as a group. I don't necessarily think of other people as dramatically different, but I do draw a line and consider them to not be my family, if that makes sense. Out groups, on the other hand, can be viewed as different, as being considered negatively. Again, I don't do this with the family, non-family issue. That may have been not the best example. But you can kind of think of this in terms of if you are an American versus someone you would construct as not being an American. We definitely see this in the political arena and in rhetoric, where other people from other countries are literally othered, are literally socially constructed as being different. And this is problematic, as we all know, in a lot of ways. if you look in the notes section of this slide, there's a little clip, hopefully it still works, from YouTube of the part where Katie, who is Lindsay Lohan's character here, is being introduced to high school and the different in and out groups in high school. And her new friends are kind of going around and in a not very politically correct way explaining the identity markers of the various groups. So if you look at that, to me that's really very much illustrating this concept of in and out groups. And then Katie eventually joins this group of on Wednesdays we wear pink, the plastics, in order to sort of infiltrate and do some high school subterfuge. It's a good film. Have a look at it. It's not perfect. After Sociology, you'll never watch TV the same again. I watched Sonic the Hedgehog this weekend with my family, and oh my gosh, the gender BS in that film. All right, anyway. Finally, reference groups are a group of people that usually encompass a occupational category or a cohort of sorts to which you compare yourself. So if you compare yourself with other folks you went to high school with or other people your age, or if you are in nursing school with other nurses or nursing students, that is a reference group for you. And they might determine how you act or what your values are. So we don't have to be members of our reference groups yet for them to be a reference group. So you can kind of consider this in the same way you might think of a role model, but extending that from one individual to an entire group. So this group has an influence on your behavior, but it's not necessarily one individual. So here are some examples. For me, a reference group is professors. So in the images on the slide here, on the left you've got an actual group of faculty at a college graduation. So literal professors. In the middle you've got the character Indiana Jones, and on the far right you've got the professors of Hogwarts from the first, I believe, Harry Potter movie. So all of those, even though some are real people and some are fictitious, are reference groups for me. They influence how I understand my role as a professor. All right, we will stop there and I will talk about the ASH test next time. Thanks.